In 1944, it took just 3 weeks at a mountain resort in Bretton Woods to crown the United States dollar as the undisputed king of global finance. For 80 years, that single decision has quietly dictated the value of every paycheck, every mortgage, and every grocery bill. But right now, a seismic shift, far more consequential than Bretton Woods, is unfolding beneath the surface. I am Alistair, and today we are going to unpack the reality of the parallel financial system being built as we speak. Indeed, in the summer of 1944, delegates from 44 nations gathered in the serene mountains of New Hampshire to effectively wipe the slate clean and rebuild the global financial architecture from the ground up. They determined which currency would dictate the pace of the world, how international trade would clear, and ultimately, who would hold the levers of absolute power. For decades, the system functioned on a tangible promise that every dollar circulating globally was theoretically anchored to physical gold stored safely in vaults. Yet, the true architectural pivot occurred in 1971. President Richard Nixon executed what economists now refer to as the Nixon shock, unilaterally terminating the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Overnight, the anchor was severed. The global reserve transformed into a pure fiat currency, backed by absolutely nothing except institutional trust. This was a trust in a single government's economic resilience, its contractual reliability, and the depth of its financial markets. To stabilize this newly floating asset, a brilliant geopolitical mechanism was engineered throughout the 1970s, known as the petrodollar consensus, by ensuring that global energy markets traded almost exclusively in dollars. An artificial perpetual demand for the currency was structurally locked in. Nations across the globe suddenly needed to stockpile greenbacks, not just to trade with Washington, but to keep their own lights on. This ingenious mechanism meant central banks began hoarding dollars, much like ordinary citizens keep cash in a secure safe. The dollar ceased to be merely a national currency. It became the fundamental operating system of the global economy. However, a system sustained entirely by confidence is inherently fragile. When the foundation of a currency shifts from tangible physical assets to the perceived stability of a single sovereign entity, it becomes highly sensitive to geopolitical gravity. For half a century, the sheer size of the underlying economy, its unmatched military reach, and the deep liquidity of its bond market masked the structural vulnerabilities of this arrangement. Trust, however, is not a renewable resource. It is a finite capital that depreciates when over-leveraged. A fiat currency functioning as the global reserve is like a magnificent suspension bridge, supported not by steel cables, but by the collective belief that those cables exist. Once the global community looks up and realizes the structural integrity is sustained merely by historical habit, the psychological collapse precedes the mathematical one. Furthermore, the mathematical reality of the current global architecture is written in a ledger that simply cannot be ignored. The sovereign debt of the United States has violently breached the $36 trillion threshold. To grasp the sheer velocity of this accumulation, one must understand that the nation is adding between $1.8 trillion and $2.2 trillion in new debt every single year. This translates to a borrowing requirement of approximately $5 billion every 24 hours merely to maintain basic governmental operations. More alarmingly, the true systemic fracture lies not within the principle, but within the terrifying mechanics of a debt spiral. Annually, the government is now hemorrhaging over $1.2 trillion solely to cover interest payments. This capital does not build a single mile of highway, it does not fund healthcare, and it does not pay down the underlying obligations. It dictates that 17 cents of every single dollar disbursed by the federal government is incinerated instantly on interest. To put this staggering figure into a geopolitical perspective, the cost of servicing this debt has now officially eclipsed the entire United States military budget. When a superpower possessing the most expensive military apparatus in human history spends more capital on the privilege of borrowing than it does on its own defense infrastructure, a terminal fiscal trajectory is confirmed. The global market is not blind to this arithmetic. The $26 trillion treasury markets, historically the premier safe haven where foreign governments parked their wealth, is exhibiting undeniable structural tremors. During peak demand, international investors held over 50% of this sovereign debt. By early 2025, that share had systematically collapsed to merely 30%. Sovereign creditors are silently and methodically liquidating their exposure to this unprecedented liability. Even Japan, the largest single foreign creditor, holding over $1.1 trillion in United States treasuries, is actively executing diversification strategies. When the primary financiers of an economic model begin a coordinated, albeit quiet, rush for the exits, it ceases to be a market fluctuation and becomes a definitive macroeconomic signal. A sovereign debt spiral of this magnitude operates much like a dying star. As the internal pressure of compounding interest continuously expands, the gravitational pull of the debt crushes the economic core until the entity can no longer sustain its own immense mass. The system does not collapse from external force, but from profound internal exhaustion. A sovereign entity that continuously finances its present by aggressively shorting its own future will inevitably find itself bankrupt of both. Consequently, the critical inflection point, the moment the slow drift toward alternative financial architectures accelerated into a sprint, occurred in February 2022 in response to the geopolitical crisis in Eastern Europe. Western powers executed an unprecedented financial maneuver, the freezing of approximately $300 billion of Russian foreign exchange reserves. These were not illicit funds. They were sovereign assets, legally accumulated through international trade, and held within Western financial institutions. Overnight, the digital ledger entries representing the wealth of a major global economy were rendered entirely inaccessible. The fundamental plumbing of global finance was explicitly transformed into an instrument of kinetic statecraft. Regardless of one's political stance on this specific conflict, the macroeconomic reverberations of this decision cannot be overstated. By weaponizing the reserve currency, the architects of the global financial system fundamentally altered the psychological risk assessment for every non-Western central bank on the planet. Financial strategists in Beijing, New Delhi, Riyadh, and Brasilia were forced to observe this precedent and ask a chilling question. If sovereign reserves can be instantly neutralized over a geopolitical dispute, is holding the dominant currency a safe haven or a strategic liability? The calculation inside global central banks immediately shifted from maximizing yield to minimizing confiscation risk. Before this event, diversifying away from the established financial networks was viewed as economically inefficient and technologically daunting. The established clearing houses possessed an overwhelming monopoly on cross-border transactions. Yet, when access to this monopoly was demonstrated to be conditionally revocable, the perceived cost of building alternatives vanished. Sovereign entities realized that the temporary economic friction of constructing a parallel network was vastly preferable to the existential threat of financial excommunication. This realization triggered a systemic pivot, not just toward alternative fiat currencies, but toward tangible, unsizable assets that carry no counterparty risk. When the global reserve currency is utilized as a coercive chokehold, it acts as a profound catalyst for financial balkanization. It forces observing nations to recognize that their economic sovereignty is merely conditional, entirely dependent on maintaining policy alignment with the currency issuer. Transforming the neutral pipelines of international commerce into a strategic weapon immediately guarantees that every independent nation will begin drilling their own wells. This single policy decision effectively shattered the illusion of financial neutrality, accelerating the construction of a parallel economic ecosystem by at least a decade. Rather than waiting for the next geopolitical shock, the immediate, measurable consequence of this psychological shift is playing out right now in the global gold markets. And it is arguably the most overlooked financial story of this decade. We are not witnessing a speculative rally. We are observing a synchronized structural asset rotation by sovereign states. In 2025 alone, over 40 central banks, spanning from Warsaw to Astana and from New Delhi to Brasilia, simultaneously executed identical policy decisions to accumulate physical gold. They absorbed an astonishing 1,237 tons of the metal. To put that into perspective, the historical average before this geopolitical awakening was barely 470 tons annually. The demand has not just doubled. It has permanently relocated to a higher plateau. This relentless accumulation culminated in a watershed moment during the second quarter of 2020. For the first time in modern financial history, the total market value of gold held by global central banks officially surpassed the value of their United States Treasury holdings. Think about the gravity of that milestone. A dormant, non-yielding metal, an asset that pays no interest, relies on no foreign government's promise, and issues no dividends, has mathematically dethroned the sovereign debt of. This is not merely an exercise in portfolio diversification. This is an aggressive architectural replacement. Simultaneously, the geopolitical coalition known as Brics has evolved from a theoretical economic acronym into a formidable operational financial bloc. With the integration of energy titans like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, alongside major demographic centers like Egypt and Ethiopia, this alliance now represents roughly 45% of global gross domestic product and commands nearly a third of the world's oil production. But their true power lies in the parallel infrastructure they are actively deploying. The cross-border interbank payment system, championed by China, has rapidly expanded to include over 1,800 indirect participants across 119 nations, connecting thousands of banking institutions worldwide. It operates as a fully functional, sanction-resistant alternative to the Western-controlled clearing networks. Furthermore, when you observe the new development bank issuing massive infrastructure loans entirely in local currencies, completely bypassing the dollar and the associated political leverage of Washington, the grand design becomes undeniable. The global economy is successfully growing a collateral circulatory system. If the traditional dollar network is a heavily monitored cardiovascular system, where a single central authority can induce a sudden cardiac arrest via sanctions, this new infrastructure is a vascular bypass, methodically constructed to keep the lifeblood of international trade flowing regardless of Western foreign policy. The plumbing of a post-dollar world is no longer on the drawing board. Predictably, this structural bypass directly threatens what is known as exorbitant privilege. This term was not coined in Washington. It was articulated with distinct frustration in the 1960s by Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, the French Minister of Finance. He was describing a unique macroeconomic phenomenon: the ability of the United States to perpetually spend more than it earns, maintain vast structural deficits, and expand its monetary base with almost zero immediate consequences. For 80 years, this implicit global subsidy has quietly financed domestic living standards, allowing the American consumer to import foreign goods cheaply, and the government to borrow at artificially suppressed interest rates, because the rest of the world was mathematically forced to absorb the liquidity. Today, this privilege is being systematically revoked by the global market. The erosion of a reserve currency does not arrive like a sudden earthquake. It is the slow, silent retreat of a glacier, fundamentally altering the economic landscape long before the public realizes the climate has changed. To understand the velocity of this shift, one must examine a chilling historical parallel. In 1948, the British pound sterling accounted for roughly double the share of global foreign exchange reserves compared to the United States dollar. The architects of the British economy believed the immense inertia of their imperial financial system would protect them indefinitely. They ignored the glaring warning signs: compounding sovereign debt, a rapidly deteriorating industrial base, and the gradual erosion of institutional trust abroad. The consequence of this complacency was brutal and swift. By 1969, a mere 2 decades later, the dollar's share of global reserves was 10 times that of the pound. By 1980, the pound's presence in global foreign exchange reserves had plummeted to a mathematically insignificant 2%. The British public did not foresee the collapse. Yet, they paid the ultimate price through a devastating generational decline in domestic purchasing power. Today, the United States dollar still maintains roughly a 57% share of global reserves, but the underlying structural trajectory bears a deeply unsettling resemblance to the twilight of the sterling era, when global demand for the dominant fiat currency contracts. The mathematical backlash is immediate and deeply personal for the average citizen. As foreign central banks and sovereign wealth funds step away from acquiring national debt, the Treasury is forced to pivot inward, offering significantly higher yields to attract domestic buyers to fund the government's daily operations. This creates a relentless upward pressure on the entire domestic credit architecture. It is the exact reason why 30-year fixed mortgage rates remain stubbornly elevated, why credit card annual percentage rates have shattered historical ceilings, and why small businesses face crippling capital acquisition costs. Moreover, as the currency weakens against a broader basket of global alternatives, evidenced by a 6% decline in the dollar index during 2025, the cost of imported electronics, pharmaceuticals, and essential raw materials predictably surges. Inflation ceases to be a temporary, cyclical phenomenon and becomes a permanent structural trap. Ultimately, the history of unbacked fiat systems is mathematically unforgiving. Since the inception of the central banking system in 1913, the currency has already forfeited approximately 97% of its domestic purchasing power. The loss of global reserve status does not destroy a nation overnight, but it guarantees that the middle class will slowly bleed out through the hidden, inescapable taxation of systemic inflation. Ultimately, the transition away from the established financial hegemony will not resemble a cinematic economic crash. There will be no singular, dramatic day where the legacy system simply ceases to function. Instead, this macroeconomic reset operates much like the slow drift of tectonic plates, imperceptible to the daily observer, yet ultimately resulting in a complete, irreversible remaking of the global landscape. The architecture designed to replace the 1944 consensus is no longer waiting in the blueprint phase. The concrete has already been poured, and the structural beams are actively being erected by dozens of sovereign nations. Navigating this new era requires a profound shift in financial perspective. Parking wealth indefinitely in a fiat system that is systematically losing its international utility is no longer a risk-free proposition. It is a passive acceptance of economic attrition. The preservation of true purchasing power now depends on recognizing that tangible, counterparty-free assets are methodically reclaiming their historical supremacy. If this objective analysis has provided clarity on the structural transformations occurring beneath the surface, consider subscribing and sharing this deep dive with those who need to understand the genuine trajectory of global finance. The data is unequivocally laid out upon the table. The historical parallels with the British pound are unmistakable. And the synchronized actions of global central banks speak far louder than any geopolitical rhetoric. The evidence leads to one profound question, which you are invited to debate in the comments. Given the unforgiving mathematics of a $36 trillion sovereign debt and the relentless expansion of parallel clearing infrastructure, can the current reserve architecture realistically survive another 50 years? The writing is on the wall. How you choose to read it is entirely up to you.